For a president who constantly insists that he's guided by constitutional fidelity and his opponents are enemies of the document itself.
MAGA Republicans do not respect the Constitution. They do not believe in the rule of law. This is a nation that honors our Constitution. We do not reject it.
He sure has a strange way of showing it. For all the professed loyalty to the rule of law and the Constitution's checks on power, this president has routinely treated its limitations as obstacles, not boundaries. He'll tell you how great the rules are right before he smashes the rules unapologetically. It's the legal equivalent of a tabloid relationship. There's a lot of talking and jumping on the couch about the commitment and how great things are, but not a lot of showing it in practice, because in actuality, the habit of this presidency has been brute force, not institutional respect. Is it legal? Who cares? By the time we find out, it'll be too late, because we already did it anyway. So go ahead and have the CDC ban every landlord in the country from evicting non-paying tenants. Who cares if there's no constitutional or statutory basis for it? Hell, who cares if the courts themselves tell us to stop? It's what the activists want. And if there's a conflict between the activists and the law, well, we know where the loyalties lie. Go ahead and try to force inject every worker at the country's larger employers. Sure, the supposed legal basis to do it has never been used in this way, but who cares? By the time the Supreme Court overturns it, many of those dummies will have caved to the pressure we created anyway. Or more recently, go ahead and try to saddle the American taxpayer with the debt of every useless gender studies degree based on some bizarre interpretation of a post-9/11 law that relieves debt for soldiers during wartime. The logic apparently being that a pink-haired cat lady facing corona is the same sort of national service and emergency as the grunt on patrol in Fallujah. At least in this case, the courts have blocked that typical strategy. Just do it first, and then when we find out it's illegal later, it'll be too late because we already did it. For now, there is no student debt cancellation. The courts halted it pending review, and now that the Supreme Court has agreed to hear the challenge, this move too will likely die the same unconstitutional death as many of this president's other illegalities. But don't worry, he was very faithful to the Constitution and the rule of law while he was soiling it worse than his Depends diaper the whole time. Again. And speaking of those military service members who rank right up there with the pink-haired deadbeats in terms of our national indebtedness, there was a similar development this week to much less discussion. It's looking more and more like in the context of the military too, we force the vaccine in a way that may in fact be illegal, but for many it's too late because it's already been injected anyway. And yeah, of course the military is a context in which you do things you don't want to do every single day that you serve. That's the point. You follow orders, but there are limitations to what those orders can be and how those orders can be given. In the same way, there would be legal problems if the president and the Defense Department ordered the military to be racially segregated tomorrow. There are legal problems with this approach too. On Tuesday, a federal appeals court in Ohio upheld the pause on discipline for members of the Air Force who have requested religious exemptions to the COVID-19 vaccine mandate, finding that the Air Force has wrongly relied on overly broad reasoning to turn down the waiver requests, meaning that some 10,000 active duty, National Guard, and Reserve airmen can continue to serve free from any disciplinary action while the matter is litigated. So it's not a question of whether the Defense Department can require vaccines in general. Of course, there are many they already do. It's a question of how it was done in this particular case. And the central issue is whether it was done with religious discrimination. The class of airmen challenging the vaccine mandate all refused for religious reasons, many citing the vaccine's use of aborted fetal tissue in either development or testing. Now, of course, just because an airman raises a religious objection does not mean the exemption is granted, either as a matter of Defense Department policy or as a matter of law. There's an entire process for making that determination. 11 steps, in fact, as far as the Defense Department's policy is concerned. As far as the law is concerned, the Federal Restoration of Religious Freedom Act, or RFRA, requires that any denial of religious exercise must further a compelling governmental interest and be the least restrictive means of achieving that interest. So the problem here is not that these requests for religious exemption were denied in general. Both the Constitution and federal law allow for that under the right circumstances. The problem is that it appears these requests for religious exemption were almost always denied, while other secular exemption requests were much more commonly granted. Many airmen sought exemptions for entirely non-religious reasons, a vaccine allergy, for example, or some airmen near retirement were granted exemptions so they could finish their Air Force career and move on as they were scheduled to without a forced vaccine on the way out. As of December of last year, thousands of these medical and administrative exemptions had been granted, over 4,200, in fact. Meanwhile, the religious exemptions granted were near a statistical zero. As of July, almost 10,000 airmen had requested religious exemption. The Air Force granted only 135, and of those, all of them were near retirement. So it's fair to speculate these exemptions relied on administrative reasons anyway, not religious accommodation. And that's a problem in that RFRA, the applicable federal law, prohibits blanket denial of religious exemption. Each case must be evaluated individually, but it appears that blanket denial of religious exemption was exactly the Air Force's policy. It's also a problem in that it trapped the government's lawyers into arguing against themselves. There are two primary questions at issue in this case. One, whether the group of 10,000 airmen was properly certified as a class by the lower court for the purposes of a class action lawsuit. There are all sorts of terms for what properly qualifies. And two, whether this class was religiously discriminated against in violation of RFRA and the First Amendment. And the trouble is, the government's lawyers want case-by-case evaluation in one context, but group evaluation in the other. Arguing against the class certification, the government's lawyers say that RFRA commands a case-by-case, individual-by-individual approach. So this group of airmen cannot be considered a class for the purpose of a class action lawsuit because the law says that each of their claims is unique and must be evaluated uniquely. But in the context of forcing the vaccine on them, well, suddenly they're all the same again. They're all just part of one big group. In challenging the bloc on enforcing the mandate, the government offered only general interests that apply to the vaccine mandate overall and thus apply to every airman. And the court caught the government on this inconsistency and told them, you have to pick one. Either the airmen are individuals with unique circumstances who thus don't qualify as a class, or they're a big group to whom universal rules apply, but not both. And so the block on the mandate for the class of airmen with religious exemption requests remains in effect, and they can continue to serve honorably while the matter continues through the courts. And it is notable that even with some 10,000 extremely dangerous unvaccinated airmen polluting the force, we haven't seen any of the damages that form the entire reason for this mandate. Where are the makeshift medical tents to handle the health emergency that the unvaccinated have created? Where are the body bags being hauled off the Air Force bases? Where is the staffing emergency caused by everybody being ill or dead? That shortage actually does exist, but it's caused by the people imposing the mandate. The Air Force, like the other branches, has struggled to meet recruiting goals. Of course, leadership denies that the vaccine mandate is at all a factor. Oh, no. It's all about political polarization, says the commander of the Air Force Recruiting Service. Right, like the polarizing of people into the groups of vaccinated heroes and unvaccinated villains. When you carve out entire groups as ineligible, you necessarily have reduced your recruitment pool. And of course, if this mandate is overturned, or if the Air Force is forced to treat religious exemption requests more fairly, like many of the other illegal moves this administration has made, for many, it will be too late because the deed is already done. You can't unvaccinate those who wanted an exemption but submitted to the pressure of what turned out to be an illegal mandate. You can't re-recruit those who decided they'd rather not bother to serve in a force that cares more about the pharmaceutical compounds in their bloodstream than it does about their prospect as a pilot. And for all the talk of following the rules, oh, these airmen should just suck it up and follow the rules. That's what you do in the military. Yeah, it is, but following the rules extends through the ranks all the way to the commander-in-chief. And unlike everybody else, the landlord, the warehouse worker, or in this case, the airman, the president is the only one rejecting the rules and facing no consequences for it. He doesn't get fined. He doesn't lose his job. He doesn't sit in a jail cell. He just gets some judicial paperwork that says, hey, don't do that next time. And then he crumples it up and proceeds to do it next time. But in fairness to the courts, it is not their responsibility to fire Biden in the same way he tries to fire everybody else. It is ours. If we do not take a habit of constitutional violations seriously, well, then neither will our president. It is either that we as a society do not care about constitutional fidelity or the rule of law, or our elections are so free and fair and fortified that our love for the most unpopular, popularly elected president of all time makes all other considerations secondary. But in either scenario, a resolution only comes from us. Perhaps an impossible task, not just because of the powers entrenched against it, but because, after all, who could possibly be prepared to handle serious conflict without a booster? The next time it happens, the flag will not be raised by bravery and grit. It will only be raised by the grace of Pfizer. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on Minds. That is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chatting my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.